Welcome to the MasterMind Library. They call me Ferdinand, the bringer of balance, leader of many disciplines, and one of your hosts of the MasterMind Library. I'm here with my co-host who's a little quiet today on episode 100. And so I'd like to introduce Trey. Hey, Trigger, is there, would you like to say hi to the audience? Mm-hmm. Okay. Say hi to the audience. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. You want to introduce the live audience that we have here? Mm-hmm. Who's that right there? Okay. Yep. So we got Huey, Elijah, and Sincere. And so today we've made it to a very special episode. Woohoo! It's episode 100. Right. So very, very proud of making it this far. Thank you everybody who's supported us and who has been appreciative. Yes. How about you pay attention for a second, okay? Wonderful baby daddy. You want to say you want some water? Okay. There you go. Thank you. All right, so in episode 100, we've started a new book. We just completed The Never-Ending Story. That was an amazing adventure of a story. I definitely felt Atreyu, and I felt Bastion, and the Moon Child, and so many other characters within the story. But what I also appreciate is completing it and being able to move on to the next story. So this next book is called Simulacra Simulation by Jean Baudrillard. Okay, and this book is the only book that's featured in the Matrix series with Keanu Reeves. This is a powerful book. Once I did a little bit of research on it, I've never read it. This is going to be my first time. All right, so let's go ahead and move forward. Let's get to the first chapter. I do great. Yes, just 1 second. Just wait a second, okay? It's late. Oh, I like baby. It's late. It's down. It's down. It's down. It's down. It's down. It's down. I like baby. It's down. It's down. Y'all all right? Yes. Okay. All right. So the first chapter of Simulacra Simulation is the procession of Simulacra. You want some more grapes? All right. You're going to have to calm down a little bit. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. The simulacrum is never what hides the truth. It is the truth that hides the fact that there is none. The simulacrum is true. Ecclesiastes. If once we were able to view the Borgias fable in which the cartographers of the empire draw up a map so detailed that it ends up covering the territory exactly, the decline of the empire witnesses the fraying of this map, little by little, and its fall into ruins. Though some shreds are still discernible in the deserts, the metaphysical beauty of this ruined abstraction testifying to a pride equal to the empire and rotting like a carcass, returning to the substance of the soil, a bit as the double ends by being confused with the real through aging. As the most beautiful allegory of simulation, this fable has now come full circle for us and possesses nothing but the discreet charm of second-order simulacra. Today, abstraction is no longer that of the map, the double, the mirror, or the concept. Simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being, or a substance. It is the generation by models of a real without origin or reality, a hyperreal. The territory no longer precedes the map, nor does it survive it. It is nevertheless the map that precedes the territory, procession of simulacra, that engenders the territory, And if one must return to the fable, today it is the territory whose shreds slowly rot across the extent of the map. It is the real and not the map, whose vestiges persist here and there in the deserts that are no longer those of the empire, but ours, the desert of the real itself. In fact, even inverted, Borges' fable is unstable. Only the allegory of the empire, perhaps, remains. Because it is with this same imperialism that present day simulators attempt to make the real, all of the real, coincide with their models of simulation. But it is no longer a question of either maps or territories. Something has disappeared. The sovereign difference between one and the other that constituted the charm of abstraction. Because it is difference that constitutes the poetry of the map and the charm of the territory, the magic of the concept and the charm of the real. This imagination of representation, which simultaneously culminates in and is engulfed by the cartographer's mad project of the ideal coextensivity of map and territory, disappears in the simulation whose operation is nuclear and genetic, no longer at all specular or discursive. It is all of metaphysics that is lost. No more mirror of being and appearances of the real and its concept. No more imaginary coextensivity. It is genetic miniaturization that is the dimension of simulation. The real is produced from miniaturized cells, matrices, and memory banks, models of control, and it can be reproduced in it can be reproduced where are we at? The real is produced from miniaturized cells, matrices, and memory banks, models of control, and it can be reproduced an indefinite number of times from these. It no longer needs to be rational because it no longer measures itself against either an ideal or negative instance. It is no longer anything but operational. In fact, it is no longer really the real because no imaginary envelops it anymore. It is a hyperreal produced from a radiating synthesis of combinatory models in a hyperspace without atmosphere. By crossing into a space whose curvature is no longer that of the real, nor that of truth, the era of simulation is inaugurated by a liquidation of all referentials. Worse, with their artificial resurrection in the systems of signs, a material more malleable than meaning, in that it lends itself to all systems of equivalences, to all binary oppositions, to all combinatory algebra. It is no longer a question of imitation, nor duplication, nor even parity. It is a question of substituting the signs of the real for the real. That is to say, of an operation of deterring every real process via its operational double, a programmatic, metastable, perfectly descriptive machine that offers all the signs of the real and short circuits all its vicissitudes. Never again will the real have the chance to produce itself. Such is the vital function of the model in a system of death, or rather of anticipated resurrection, that no longer even gives the event of death a chance. A hyperreal henceforth sheltered from the imaginary, and from any distinction between the real and the imaginary, leaving only room for the orbital recurrence of models and for the simulated generation of differences. Sit down. Give you a book, and you could do some writing. Yep, there you go. Right. You got to write in silence, so okay. All right. Where's your? Give you what you need. Write quietly. Okay. There you go. All right. The divine irreference of images to dissimulate. To dissimulate is to pretend not to have what one has. Dissimulate is to feign to have what one doesn't have. One implies a presence, the other an absence. But it is more complicated than that because simulating is not pretending. Whoever fakes an illness can simply stay in bed and make everyone believe he is ill. Whoever simulates an illness produces in himself some of the symptoms. Litter. Therefore, pretending or dissimulating leaves the principle of reality intact. The difference is always clear. It is simply masked, whereas simulation threatens the difference between the true and the false, the real and the imaginary. Is the simulator sick or not, given that he produces true symptoms? Objectively, one cannot treat him as being either ill or not ill. Psychology and medicine stop at this point, forestalled by the illness's henceforth undiscoverable truth. For if any symptom can be produced and can no longer be taken as a fact of nature, then every illness can be considered as simulatable and simulated, and medicine loses its meaning since it only knows how to treat real illnesses according to their objective causes. Psychosomatics evolves in a dubious manner at the borders of the principle of illness. As to psychoanalysis, it transfers the symptom of the organic order to the unconscious order. The latter is new and taken for real, more real than the other. But why would simulation be at the gates of the unconscious? Why couldn't the work of the unconscious be produced in the same way as any old symptom of classical medicine? Dreams already are. Certainly, the psychiatrist purports that for every form of mental alienation, there is a particular order in the succession of symptoms of which the simulator is ignorant and in the absence of which the psychiatrist would not be deceived. This, which dates from 1865, in order to safeguard the principle of a truth at all costs and to escape the interrogation posed by simulation, the knowledge that truth, reference, objective cause have ceased to exist. Now, what can medicine do with what floats on either side of illness, on either side of health, with the duplication of illness in a discourse that is no longer either true or false? What can psychoanalysis do with the duplication of the discourse of the unconscious in the discourse of simulation that can never again be unmasked, since it is not false either? What can the army do about simulators? Traditionally, it unmasks them and punishes them according to a clear principle of identification. Today, it can discharge a very good simulator as exactly equivalent to a real homosexual, a heart patient, or a madman. Even military psychology draws back from Cartesian certainties and hesitates to make the distinction between true and false, between the produced and the authentic symptom. If he is this good at acting crazy, it's because he is. Nor is military psychology mistaken in this regard. In this sense, all crazy people simulate, and this lack of distinction is the worst kind of subversion. It is against this lack of distinction that classical reason armed itself in all its categories, but it is what today again outflanks them. submerging the principle of truth. Beyond medicine and the army favored terrains of simulation, the question returns to religion and the simulacrum of divinity. I forbade that there be any simulacra in the temples because the divinity that animates nature can never be represented. Indeed, it can be. But what becomes of the divinity when it reveals itself in icons? When it is multiplied in simulacra? Does it remain the supreme power that is simply incarnated in images as a visible theology? Or does it volatilize, volatilize, volatilize itself in the simulacra that alone deploy their power and pomp of fascination, the visible machinery of icon substituted for the pure and intelligible idea of God? This is precisely what was feared by iconoclasts, whose millennial quarrel is still with us today. This is precisely because they predicted this omnipotence of simulacra, the faculty simulacra have of effacing God from the conscience of man, and the destructive, annihilating truth that they allow to appear, that deep down God never existed, that only the simulacrum ever existed, even that God himself was never anything but his own simulacrum. From this came their urge to destroy the images. If they could have believed that these images only obfuscated or masked the Platonic idea of God, there would have been no reason to destroy them. One can live with the idea of distorted truth, but their metaphysical despair came from the idea that the image didn't conceal anything at all, and that these images were, in essence, not images, such as an original model would have made them, but perfect simulacra, forever radiant with their own fascination. Thus, the death of the divine referential must be exercised at all costs. One can see that the iconoclasts, whom one accuses of disdaining and negating images, were those who accorded them their true value, in contrast to the iconolaters, who only saw reflections in them and were content to venerate a filigree god. On the other hand, one can say that the icon worshippers were the most modern minds, the most adventurous, because in the guise of having God become apparent in the mirror of images, they were already enacting his death and his disappearance in the epiphany of his representations, which perhaps they already knew no longer represented anything, that they were purely a game, but that it was therein the great game lay, knowing also that it is dangerous to unmask images, since they dissimulate the fact that there is nothing behind them. This was the approach of the Jesuits, who founded their politics on the virtual disappearance of God and on the worldly and spectacular manipulation of consciences, the evanescence of God in the epiphany of power, the end of transcendence, which now only serves as an alibi for a strategy altogether free of influences and signs. Behind the baroqueness of images hides the eminence, grease of politics. This way, the stake will always have been the murderous power of images, murderers of the real, murderers of their own model, as the Byzantine icons could be those of divine identity. To the murderous power is opposed that of representations as a dialectal power, the visible and intelligible meditation of the real. All Western faith and good faith became engaged in this wager on representation, that a sign could refer to the depth of meaning, that a sign could be exchanged for meaning, and that something could guarantee this exchange. God, of course. But what if God himself can be simulated? That is to say, can be reduced to the signs that constitute faith? Then the whole system becomes weightless. It is no longer itself anything but a gigantic simulacrum, not unreal, but a simulacrum. That is to say, never exchanged for the real, but exchanged for itself in an uninterrupted circuit without reference or circumference. Such is simulation, insofar as it is opposed to representation. Representation stems from the principle of the equivalence of the sign and of the real, even if this equivalence is utopian. It is a fundamental axiom. Simulation, on the contrary, stems from the utopia of the principle of equivalence, from the radical negation of the sign as value, from the sign as the the reversion and death sentence of every reference, whereas representation attempts to absorb simulation by interpreting it as a false representation. Simulation envelops the whole edifice of representation itself as a simulacrum. Such would be the successive phases of the image. It is the reflection of a profound reality. It masks and denatures a profound reality. It masks the absence of a profound reality. It has no relation to any reality whatsoever. It is its own pure simulacrum. In the first case, the image is a good appearance. Representation is of the sacramental order. In the second, it is an evil appearance. It is of the order of maleficence. In the third, it plays at being an appearance. It is of the order of sorcery. In the fourth, it is no longer of the order of appearances, but of simulation. The transition from signs that dissimulate something to signs that dissimulate that there is nothing marks a decisive turning point. The first reflects a theology of truth and secrecy, to which the notion of ideology still belongs. The second inaugurates the era of simulacra and of simulation, in which there is no longer a God to recognize his own, no longer a last judgment to separate the false from the true, the real from its artificial resurrection, as everything is already dead and resurrected in advance. When the real is no longer what it is, nostalgia assumes its full meaning. There is a plethora of myths of origin and of signs of reality, a plethora of truth, of secondary objectivity and authenticity, escalation of the true, of lived experience, resurrection of the figurative where the object and substance have appeared, panic-stricken production of the real and of the referential, parallel to and greater than the panic of material production. This is how simulation appears in the phase that concerns us, a strategy of the real, of the neo-real and the hyper-real, that everywhere is the double of a strategy of deterrence. Ramses, or the rosy-colored resurrection. Ethnology brushed up against its paradoxical death in 1971, the day when the Philippine government decided to return the few dozen Tazaday who had just been discovered in the depths of the jungle, where they had lived for 8 centuries without any contact with the rest of the species, to their primitive state, out of the reach of colonizers, tourists, and ethnologists. This at the suggestion of the anthropologists themselves, who were seeing the indigenous people disintegrate immediately upon contact, like mummies in the open air. In order for ethnology to live, its object must die. By dying, The object takes its revenge for being discovered, and with its death defies the science that wants to grasp it. Doesn't all science live on this paradoxical slope to which it is doomed by the evanescence of its object in its very apprehension, and by the pitiless re- reversal that the dead object exerts on it? Like Orpheus, it always turns around too soon, and like Eurydice, its object falls back into Hades. It is against this hell of the paradox that the ethnologists wish to protect themselves by cordoning off the Tazidae with virgin forests. No one can touch them anymore. As in a mine, the vein is closed down. Science loses precious capital there, but the object will be safe, lost to science, but intact in its virginity. It is not a question of sacrifice. Science never sacrifices itself. It is always murderous, but of the simulated sacrifice of its object in order to save its reality principle. The Tacidae, frozen in their natural element, will provide a perfect alibi, an eternal guarantee. Here begins an antithnology, antithnology that will never end, and to which Jalil, Castaneda, Clastres are various witnesses. In any case, the logical evolution of a science is to distance itself increasingly from its object until it dispenses with it entirely. Its autonomy is only rendered even more fantastic. It attains its pure form. The Indian thus returned to the ghetto. In the glass coffin of the virgin forest, again becomes the model of simulation of all the possible Indians from before ethnology. Thus model the this model thus grants itself the luxury to incarnate itself beyond itself in the brute reality of these Indians it has entirely reinvented. Savages who are indebted to ethnology for still being savages. What a turn of events! What a triumph for this science that seemed dedicated to their destruction. Of course, these savages are posthumous, frozen, cryogenized, sterilized, protected to death. They have become referential simulacra, and science itself has become pure simulation. The same holds true at Crusat, at the level of the open museum, where one museumified in situ as historical witnesses of their period, entire working class neighborhoods, living metallurgic zones, an entire culture, men, women, and children included, gestures, languages, customs fossilized alive as in a snapshot. The museum, instead of being circumscribed as a geometric site, is everywhere now, like a dimension of life. Thus, ethnology, rather than circumscribing itself as an objective science, will today, liberated from its object, be applied to all living things and make itself invisible, like an omnipresent fourth dimension, that of the simulacrum. We are all Tacidaes, Indians who have again become what they are, simulacral Indians, who at last proclaim the universal truth of ethnology. We have all become living specimen of the spectral light of ethnology, or of anti-ethnology, which is nothing but the pure form of triumphal ethnology under the sign of dead differences and of the resurrection of differences. It is thus very naive to look for ethnology in the savages or in some third world. It is here, everywhere, in the metropolises, in the white community, in a world completely cataloged and analyzed, then artificially resurrected under the auspices of the real. In a world of simulation, of the hallucination of truth, of the blackmail of the real, of the murder of every symbolic form, and of its historical retrospection, a murder of which the savages, noblesse oblige, were the first victims, but that for a long time has extended to all Western societies. But in the same breath, ethnology grants us its only and final lesson, the secret that kills it, and which the savages knew better than it did, the vengeance of the dead. The confinement of the scientific objective is equal to the confinement of the mad and the dead. And just as all of society is irremediably contaminated by this mirror of madness that it has held up to itself, science can't help but die contaminated by the death of this object that is its inverse mirror. It is science that masters the objects, but it is the objects that invest it with depth, according to an unconscious reversion, which only gives a dead and circular response to a dead and circular interrogation. Nothing changes when society breaks the mirror of madness, abolishes the asylums, gives speech back to the insane, etc., nor when science seems to break the mirror of its objectivity, effacing itself before its object, as in Castaneda, etc., and to bend down before the differences. The form produced by confinement is followed by an innumerable, diffracted, slowed down mechanism. As ethnology collapses in its classical institution, it survives in an anti-ethnology whose task it is to re-inject the difference friction, the savage fiction, the difference friction, the savage fiction everywhere, to conceal that it is this world, ours, which has again become savage in its way. That is to say, which is devastated by difference and by death. In the same way, with the pretext of saving the original, one forbids visitors to enter the Lascaux caves, but an exact replica was constructed 500 meters from it so that everyone could see them. One glances through a peephole at the authentic cave, and then one visits the reconstituted whole. It is possible that the memory of the original grottos is itself stamped in the minds of future generations. But from now on, there is no longer any difference. The duplication suffices to render both artificial. In the same way, science and technology were recently mobilized to save the mummy of Ramses II, after it was left to rot for several dozen years in the depths of a museum. The West is seized with panic at the thought of not being able to save what the symbolic order had been able to conserve for 40 centuries. But out of sight and far from the light of day, Ramses does not signify anything for us, but only the mummy is of an inestimable worth, because it is what guarantees that accumulation has meaning. Our entire linear and accumulative culture collapses if we cannot stockpile the past in plain view. To this end, the pharaohs must be brought out of their tomb and the mummies out of their silence. To this end, they must be exhumed and given military honors. They are prey to both science and worms. Only the absolute secrecy assured them this millennial power, the mastery over putrefaction that signified the mastery of the complete cycle of exchanges with death. We only know how to place our science in service of repairing the mummy, that is to say, restoring a visible order, whereas embalming was a mythical effort that strove to immortalize a hidden dimension. We require a visible past, a visible continuum, a visible myth of origin, which reassures us about our end, because finally we have never believed in them. Whence this historic scene of the reception of the mummy at the Orly airport. Why? Because Ramses was a great despotic and military figure? Certainly, but mostly because our culture dreams behind this defunct power that it tries to annex of an order that would have had nothing to do with it. And it dreams of it because it exterminated it by exhuming it as its own past. We are fascinated by Ramses as Renaissance Christians were by the American Indians. Those human beings who had never known the word of Christ. Thus, at the beginning of colonization, there was a moment of stupor and bewilderment before the very possibility of escaping the universal law of the gospel. There were two possible responses: either admit that this law was not universal, or exterminate the Indians to efface the evidence. In general, one contented oneself with converting them, or even simply discovering them, which would suffice to slowly exterminate them. Thus, it would have been enough to exhume Ramses to ensure his extermination by museumification. Because mummies don't rot from worms, they die from being transplanted from a slow order of the symbolic, master over putrefaction and death, to an order of history, science, and museums, our order, which no longer masters anything, which only knows how to condemn what preceded it to decay and death, and subsequently to try to revive it with science. Irreparable violence toward all secrets, the violence of a civilization without secrets, hatred of a whole civilization for its own foundation. And just as with ethnology, which plays at extricating itself from its object to better secure itself in its pure form, demuseumification is nothing but another spiral in artificiality. Witness the cloister of St. Michael de Cuxa, which one will repatriate at great cost from the cloisters in New York to reinstall it in its original site. And everyone is supposed to applaud this restitution, as they did the experimental campaign to take back the sidewalks on the Champs Elysees. Well, if the exportation of the cornices was in effect an arbitrary act, if the cloisters in New York are an artificial mosaic of all cultures, following a logic of the capitalist centralization of value, their reimportation to the original site is even more artificial. It is a total simulacrum that links up with reality through a complete circumvolution. Circumvolution. The cloister should have stayed in New York, in its simulated environment, which at least fooled no one. Repatriating it is nothing but a supplementary subterfuge, acting as if nothing had happened and indulging in retrospective hallucination. In the same way, Americans flatter themselves for having brought the population of Indians back to pre-conquest levels. One effaces everything and starts over. They even flatter themselves for doing better, for exceeding the original number. This is presented as proof of the superiority of civilization. It will produce more Indians than they themselves were able to do. With Senator derision, this overproduction is again a means of destroying them. For Indian culture, like all tribal culture, rests on the limitation of the group and the refusal of any unlimited increase, as can be seen in Ishii's case. In this way, their demographic promotion is just another step towards symbolic extermination. Everywhere we live in a universe strangely similar to the original, things are doubled by their own scenario. But this doubling does not signify, as it did traditionally, the imminence of their death. They are already purged of their death, and better than when they were alive, more cheerful, more authentic, in the light of their model, like the faces in funeral homes. The hyper real and the imaginary. Disneyland is a perfect model of all the entangled orders of simulacra. It is, first of all, a play of illusions and phantasms. The pirates, the frontier, the future world, etc. The imaginary world is supposed to ensure the success of the operation. But what attracts the crowds the most is without a doubt the social microcosm, the religious, miniaturized pleasure of real America, of its constraints and joys. One parks outside and stands in line inside. One is altogether abandoned at the exit. The only phantasmagoria in this imaginary world lies in the tenderness and warmth of the crowd, and in the sufficient and excessive number of gadgets necessary to create the multitudinous effect. The contrast with the absolute solitude of the parking lot, a veritable concentration camp, is total. Or, rather, inside a whole panoply of gadgets magnetizes the crowd in directed flows. Outside, solitude is directed at a single gadget, the automobile. By an extraordinary coincidence, but this derives without a doubt from the enchantment inherent to this universe. This frozen, childlike world is found to have been conceived and realized by a man who is himself now cryogenized, Walt Disney, who awaits his resurrection through an increase of 180 degrees centigrade. Thus, everywhere in Disney, the objective profile of America, down to the morphology of individuals and of the crowd, is drawn. All of its values are exalted by the miniature and the cosmic strip, embalmed and pacified. Whence the possibility of an ideological analysis of Disneyland. El Marin did it very well in Utopiques, Joe Despace, Utopia's Place of Space, Digest of the American Way of Life, Panegyric of American Values, Idealized transposition of a contradictory reality. Certainly, but this plays something else, and this ideological blanket functions as a cover for the simulation of the third order. Disneyland exists in order to hide that it is the real country, all of real America that is Disneyland. A bit like prisons are there to hide that it is the social in its entirety, in the banal omnipresence that is carceral. Disneyland is presented as imaginary in order to make us believe that the rest is real, whereas all of Los Angeles and the America that surrounds it are no longer real, but belong to the hyperreal order and to the order of simulation. It is no longer a question of a false representation of reality, ideology, but of concealing the fact that the real is no longer real, and thus of saving the reality principle. The imaginary of Disneyland is neither true nor false. It is a deterrence machine set up in order to rejuvenate the fiction of the real in the opposite camp, whence the debility of the imaginary, its infantile degeneration. This world wants to be childish in order to make us believe that the adults are elsewhere in the real world, and to conceal the fact that true childishness is everywhere, that it is that of the adults themselves who come here to act the child in order to foster illusions as to their real childishness. Disneyland is not the only one, however. Enchanted Village, Magic Mountain, Marine World, Los Angeles is surrounded by these imaginary stations that feed reality, the energy of the real, to a city whose mystery is precisely that of no longer being anything but a network of incessant, unreal circulation, a city of incredible proportions, but without space, without dimension. Some water. As much as electrical and atomic power stations, as much as cinema studios, this city, which is no longer anything but an immense scenario and a perpetual pan shot, needs this old imaginary like a sympathetic nervous system made up of childhood signals and faked phantasms. Disneyland, a space of regeneration of the imaginary as waste treatment plants are elsewhere. And even here, everywhere today, one must recycle waste. And the dreams, the phantasms, the historical, fairy-like, legendary imaginary of children and adults is a waste product. The first great toxic excrement of a hyperreal civilization. On a mental level, Disneyland is the prototype of this new function. But all the sexual, psychic, somatic recycling institutes which proliferate in California belong to the same order. People no longer look at each other, but there are institutes for that. They no longer touch each other, but there are contactotherapy. But there is contactotherapy. They no longer walk, but they go jogging, etc. Everywhere one recycles lost faculties or lost bodies or lost sociality or the lost taste for food, one reinvents penury, asceticism, vanished savage naturalness, natural food, health food, yoga. Marshall Sahlins' idea that it is the economy of the market and not of nature at all that secretes penury is verified. But at a secondary level, here, in the sophisticated confines of a triumphal market economy, is reinvented a penury sign, a penury simulacrum, a simulated behavior of the underdeveloped, including the adoption of Marxist tenets that, in the guise of ecology, of energy crisis, and the critique of capital, adds a final esoteric aureole to the triumph of an esoteric culture. Nevertheless, maybe a mental catastrophe, a mental implosion, and involution without precedent lies in wait for a system of this kind, whose visible signs would be those of this strange obesity, or the incredible coexistence of the most bizarre theories and practices, which correspond to the improbable coalition of luxury, heaven, and money, to the improbable luxurious materialization of life, and to undiscoverable contradictions. Political incantation, Watergate. The same scenario as in Disneyland, effect of the imaginary concealing that reality no more exists outside than inside the limits of artificial perimeter. Here, the scandal effect hiding that there is no difference between the facts and their denunciation. Identical methods on the part of the CIA and of the Washington Post journalists. Same operation, tending to regenerate through scandal a moral and political principle, through the imaginary, a sinking reality principle. The denunciation of scandal is always an homage to the law. And Watergate, in particular, succeeded in imposing the idea that Watergate was a scandal. In this sense, it was a prodigious operation of intoxication, a large dose of political morality re-injected on a world scale. One could say, along with Bordeaux, the essence of every relation of force is to dissimulate itself as such and to acquire all its force only because it dissimulates itself as such. Understood as follows. Capital, immoral and without scruples, can only function behind a moral superstructure, and whoever revives this public morality through indignation, denunciation, etc., works spontaneously for the order of capital. This is what the journalists of the Washington Post did. But this would be nothing but the formula of ideology, and when Bordeaux states it, he takes the relation of force for the truth of capitalist domination, and he himself denounces this relation of force as scandal. He is thus in the same deterministic and moralistic position as the Washington Post journalists are. He does the same work of purging and reviving moral order, an order of truth in which the veritable symbolic violence of the social order is engendered, well beyond all the relations of force, which are only its shifting and indifferent configuration in the moral and political consciences of men. All that capital asks of us is to receive it as rational or to combat it in the name of rationality, to receive it as moral or to combat it in the name of morality, because these are the same, which can be thought of in another way. Formerly, one worked to dissimulate scandal. Today, one works to conceal that there is none. Watergate is not a scandal. This is what must be said at all costs, because it is what everyone is busy concealing. This dissimulation masking a strengthening of morality, of a moral panic as one approaches the primitive, Messian scene of capital, its instantaneous cruelty, its incomprehensible ferocity, its fundamental immorality. That is what is scandalous, unacceptable to the system of moral and economic equivalence. That is the axiom of leftist thought, from the theories of the Enlightenment up to communism. One imputes this thinking to the contract of capital, but it doesn't give a damn. It is a monstrous, unprincipled enterprise. Nothing more. It is enlightened thought that seeks to control it by imposing rules on it, and all the recrimination that replaces revolutionary thought today comes back to incriminate capital for not following the rules of the game. Power is unjust. Its justice is a class justice. Capital exploits us, etc., as if capital were linked by a contract to the society it rules. It is the left that holds out the mirror of equivalence to capital, hoping that it will comply with this phantasmagoria of the social contract and fulfill its obligations to the whole of society. By the same token, no need for a revolution. It suffices that capital accommodate itself to the rational formula of exchange. Capital, in fact, was never linked by a contract to the society that it dominates. It is a sorcery of social relations. It is a challenge to society, and it must be responded to as such. It is not a scandal to be denounced according to moral, and economic rationality, but a challenge to take up according to symbolic law. Mobius, spiraling negativity. Watergate was thus nothing but a lure held out by the system to catch its adversaries, a simulation of scandal for regenerative ends. In the film, this is embodied by the character of Deep Throat, who was said to be the eminence grease of the Republicans, manipulating the left-wing journalists in order to get rid of Nixon. And why not? All hypotheses are possible, but this one is superfluous. The left itself does a perfectly good job and spontaneously of doing the work of the right. Besides, it would be naive to see an embittered good conscience at work here, because manipulation is a wavering casualty in which positivity and negativity are engendered and overlap, in which there is no longer either an active or a passive. It is through the arbitrary cessation of this spiraling causality, It is through the arbitrary cessation of this spiraling causality that a principle of political reality can be saved. It is through the simulation of a narrow, conventional field of perspective in which the premises and the consequences of an act or of an event can be calculated, that a political credibility can be maintained, and of course, objective analysis, the struggle, etc. If one envisions the entire cycle of any act or event in a system where linear continuity and dialectical polarity no longer exist, in a field unhinged by simulation, all determination evaporates. Every act is terminated at the end of the cycle, having benefited everyone and having been scattered in all directions. Is any given bombing in Italy the work of leftist extremists, or extreme right provocation, or a centrist mise en scene to discredit all extreme terrorists and to shore up its own failing power? Or again, is it a police-inspired scenario and a form of blackmail to public scrutiny? All of this is simultaneously true. And the search for proof, indeed, the objectivity of the fact, does not put an end to this vertigo of interpolation. That is, we are in a logic of simulation, which no longer has anything to do with a logic of facts and an order of reason. Simulation is characterized by a procession of the model, of all the models based on the merest fact. The models come first. Their circulation, orbital like that of a bomb, constitutes the genuine magnetic field of the event. The facts no longer have a specific trajectory. They are born at the intersection of models. A single fact can be engendered by all the models at once. This anticipation, this precession, this short circuit, this confusion of the fact with its model, no more divergence of meaning, no more dialectical polarity, no more negative electricity, implosion of antagonistic poles, is what allows each time for all possible interpretations, even the most contradictory, all true, in the sense that their truth is to be exchanged in the image of the models from which they derive. In a generalized cycle, the communists attacked the Socialist Party as if they wished to shatter the union of the left. They give credence to the idea that these resistances would come from a more radical political need. In fact, it is because they no longer want power. But do they not want power at this juncture? One unfavorable to the left in general, or unfavorable to them within the union of the left? Or do they no longer want it by definition? When Berlinger declares, There is no need to be afraid to see the communists take power in Italy. It simultaneously signifies that there is no need to be afraid, since the communists, if they come to power, will change nothing of its fundamental capitalist mechanism. That there is no risk. That there is no risk that they will ever come to power because they don't want to. And even if they occupy the seat of power, they will never exercise it except by proxy. That in fact, power, genuine power, no longer exists. And thus, there is no risk whoever seizes power or seizes it again. But further, I, Berlinger, am not afraid to see the communists take power in Italy, which may seem self-evident, but not as much as you might think, because it could mean the opposite. No need for psychoanalysis here. I am afraid to see the communists take power, and there are good reasons for that, even for a communist. All of this is simultaneously true. It is the secret of a discourse that is no longer simply ambiguous, as political discourses can be, but that conveys the impossibility of a determined position of power, the impossibility of a determined discursive position. And this logic is neither that of one party nor of another. It traverses all discourses without them wanting it to. Who will unravel this imbroglio? The Gordian knot can at least be cut. The Mobius strip, if one divides it, results in a supplementary spiral without the reversibility of surfaces being resolved. Here, the reversible continuity of a hypothesis, hell of simulation, which is no longer one of torture, but of the subtle, maleficent, elusive twisting meaning, where even the condemned at Burgos are still a gift from Franco to Western democracy, which seizes the occasion to regenerate its own flagging humanism and whose indignant protest in turn consolidates Franco's regime by uniting the Spanish masses against this foreign intervention. Where is the truth of all that? When such collusions admirably knot themselves together without the knowledge of their authors. Conjunction of the system and of its extreme alternative, like the two sides of a curved mirror, a vicious curvature of a political space that is henceforth magnetized, circularized, reversibilized from the right to the left, a torsion that is like that of the evil spirit of commutation. The whole system, the infinity of capital folded back on its own surface, transfinite. And is it not the same for desire and the libidinal space? Conjunction of desire and value, of desire and capital, conjunction of desire and the law, the final pleasure as the metamorphosis of the law, which is why it is so widely the order of the day. Only capital takes pleasure, said Lyotard, before thinking that we now take pleasure in capital. Overwhelming versatility of desire in Deleuze, an enigmatic reversal that brings desire, revolutionary in itself, and as if involuntary, wanting what it wants, to desire its own repression, and to invest in paranoid and fascist systems, a malign torsion that returns this revolution of desire to the same fundamental ambiguity as the other, the historical revolution. All the referentials combine their discourses in a circular, Mobian compulsion. Not so long ago, sex and work were fiercely opposed terms. Today, both are dissolved in the same type of demand. Formerly, the discourse on history derived its power from violently opposing itself to that of nature, the discourse of desire to that of power. Today, they exchange their signifiers and their scenarios. It would take too long to traverse the entire range of the operational negativity of all those scenarios of deterrence, which, like Watergate, tried to regenerate a moribund principle through simulated scandal, phantasm, murder, a sort of hormonal treatment through negativity and crisis. It is always a question of proving the real through the imaginary, proving truth through scandal, proving the law through transgression, proving work through striking, proving the system through crisis, and capital through revolution. As it is elsewhere, the Tazide, of proving ethnology through the disposition of its object, without taking into account the proof of theater through anti-theater, the proof of art through anti-art, the proof of pedagogy through anti-pedagogy, the proof of psychiatry through anti-psychiatry, etc. Everything is metamorphosed into its opposite to perpetuate itself in its expurgated form. All the powers, all the institutions speak of themselves through denial in order to attempt, by simulating death, to escape their real death throes. Power can stage its own murder to rediscover a glimmer of existence and legitimacy. Such was the case with some American presidents. The Kennedys were murdered because they still had a political dimension. The others, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, only had the right to phantom attempts to simulated murders. But this aura of an artificial menace was still necessary to conceal that they were no longer anything but the mannequins of power. Formerly, the king, also the god, had to die. Therein lay the power. Today, he is miserably forced to fiend death in order to preserve the blessing of power. But it is lost. To seek new blood in its own death, to renew the cycle through the mirror of crisis, negativity, and anti-power. This is the only solution, alibi of every power, of every institution attempting to break the vicious cycle of its irresponsibility and of its fundamental non-existence and of its already seen and of its already dead. The strategy of the real. The impossibility of rediscovering an absolute level of the real is of the same order as the impossibility of staging illusion. Illusion is no longer possible because the real is no longer possible. It is the whole political problem of parody, of hyper simulation, of offensive simulation that is posed here. For example, it would be interesting to see whether the repressive apparatus would not react more violently to a simulated holdup than to a real holdup, because the latter does nothing but disturb the order of things, the right to property, whereas the former attacks the reality principle itself. Transgression and violence are less serious because they only contest the distribution of the real. Simulation is infinitely more dangerous because it always leaves open the supposition that, above and beyond its object, law and order themselves might be nothing but simulation. But the difficulty is proportional to the danger. How to feign a violation and put it to the test. Simulate a robbery in a large store. How to persuade security that it is a simulated robbery. There is no objective difference. The gestures, the signs, are the same as for a real robbery. The signs do not lean to one another, to one side or another, to the established order. They are always of the order of the real. Organize a fake holdup. Verify that your weapons are harmless and take the most trustworthy hostage so that no human life will be in danger or one lapses into the criminal. Demand a ransom and make it so that the operation creates as much commotion as possible. In short, remain close to the truth in order to test the reaction of the apparatus to a perfect simulacrum. You won't be able to do it. The network of artificial signs will become inextricably mixed up with real elements. A policeman will really fire on sight. A client of the bank will faint and die of a heart attack. One will actually pay you the phony ransom. In short, you will immediately find yourself once again, without wishing it, in the real, one of whose functions is precisely to devour any attempt at simulation, to reduce everything to the real, that is, to the established order itself, well before the institutions and justice come into play. It is necessary to see in this impossibility of isolating the process of simulation the weight of an order that cannot see and conceive of anything but the real, because it cannot function anywhere else. The simulation of an offense, if it is established as such, will either be punished less severely because it has no consequences, or punished as an offense against the judicial system. For example, if one sets in motion a police operation for nothing, but never as simulation, since it is precisely as such that no equivalence with the real is possible, and hence no repression either. The challenge of simulation is never admitted by power. How can the simulation of virtue be punished? However, as such, it is as serious as the simulation of crime. Parity renders submission and transgression equivalent. And that is the most serious crime, because it cancels out the difference upon which the law is based. The established order can do nothing against it, because the law is a simulacrum of the second order, whereas simulation is of the third order, beyond true and false, beyond equivalences, beyond rational distinctions upon which the whole of the social and power depend, thus lacking the real. It is there that we must aim at order. This is certainly why the order always opts for the real. When in doubt, it always prefers this hypothesis. As in the army, one prefers to take the simulator for a real madman. But this becomes more and more difficult, because if it is practically impossible to isolate the process of simulation through the force of inertia of the real that surrounds us, the opposite is also true. And this reversibility itself is part of the apparatus of simulation and the impotence of power. Namely, it is now impossible to isolate the process of the real or to prove the real. This is how all the holdups, airplane hijackings, etc., are now in some sense simulation holdups, in that they are already inscribed in the decoding and orchestration rituals of the media, anticipated in their presentation and their possible consequences. In short, where they function as a group of signs dedicated exclusively to their recurrence as signs, and no longer at all to their real end. But this does not make them harmless. On the contrary, it is as hyperreal events, no longer with a specific content or end, but indefinitely refracted by each other, just like so-called historical events, strikes, demonstrations, crises, etc. It is in this sense that they cannot be controlled by an order that can only exert itself on the real and the rational, on causes and ends, a referential order that can only reign over the referential, a determined power that can only reign over a determined world, but that cannot do anything against this indefinite recurrence of simulation, against the nebula whose weight no longer obeys the laws of gravitation of the real. Power itself ends by being dismantled in this space and becoming a simulation of power, disconnected from its ends and its objectives, and dedicated to the effects of power and mass simulation. The only weapon of power, its only strategy against this defection, is to re-inject the real and the referential everywhere, to persuade us of the reality of the social, of the gravity of the economy, and the finalities of production. To this end, it prefers the discourse of crisis, but also, why not, that of desire. Take your desires for reality can be understood as the ultimate slogan of power, since in a non-referential world. Even the confusion of the reality principle and the principle of desire is less dangerous than contagious hyperreality. One remains among principles, and among those power is always in the right. Hyperreality and simulation are deterrents of every principle and every objective. They turn against power and the deterrent that is used so well for such a long time, because in the end, throughout its history, it was capital that first fed on the destructuration of every referential, of every human objective, that shattered every ideal distinction between true and false, good and evil, in order to establish a radical law of equivalence and exchange, the iron law of its power. Capital was first to play at deterrence, abstraction, disconnection, deteriorization, etc. And if it is the one that fostered reality, the reality principle, it was also the first to liquidate it by exterminating all use value, all real equivalence of production and wealth. In the very sense we have of the unreality of the stakes and the omnipotence of manipulation. Well, today it is this same logic that is even more set against capital. And as soon as it wishes to combat this disastrous spiral by secreting a last glimmer of reality on which to establish a last glimmer of power, it does nothing but multiply the signs and accelerate the play of simulation. As long as the historical threat came at it from the real, power played at deterrence and simulation, disintegrating all the contradictions by dint of producing equivalent signs. Today, when the danger comes at it from simulation, that of being dissolved in the play of signs, power plays at the real, plays at crisis, plays at remanufacturing artificial, social, economic, and political stakes. For power, it is a question of life and death, but it is too late. Whence the characteristic hysteria of our times, that of the production and reproduction of the real. The other production, cover your mouth. The other production, that of values and commodities, that of the Belle Epoque of political economy, has for a long time had no specific meaning. What every society looks for in continuing to produce and to overproduce is to restore the real that escapes it. That is why today the material production is that of the hyperreal itself. It retains all the features, the whole discourse of traditional production, but it is no longer anything but its scaled down refraction. Thus, hyperrealists fix a real from which all meaning and charm, all depth and energy of representation have vanished in a hallucinatory resemblance. Thus, everywhere the hyperrealism of simulation is translated by the hallucinatory resemblance of the real to itself. Power itself has for a long time produced nothing but the signs of its resemblance. And at the same time, another figure of power comes into play, that of a collective demand for signs of power, a holy union that is reconstructed around its disappearance. The whole world adheres to it more or less in terror of the collapse of the political, and in the end, the game of power becomes nothing but the critical obsession with power, obsession with its death, obsession with its survival, which increases as it disappears. When it has totally disappeared, we will logically be under the total hallucination of power, a haunting memory that is already in evidence everywhere, expressing at once the compulsion to get rid of it. No one wants it anymore. Everyone unloads it on everyone else. And the panicked nostalgia over its loss, the melancholy of societies without power. This has already stirred up fascism, that overdose of a strong referential in a society that cannot terminate its mourning. With the extenuation of the political sphere, the president comes increasingly to resemble that puppet of power who is the head of primitive societies, clastries. All previous presidents pay for and continue to pay for Kennedy's murder as if they were the ones who had suppressed it, which is true phantasmatically, if not in fact. They must efface this defect and this complicity with their simulated murder because now it can only be simulated. Presidents Johnson and Ford were both the object of failed assassination attempts, which they were not staged, were at least perpetuated by simulation. The Kennedys died because they incarnated something, the political substance, whereas the new presidents are nothing but caricatures and fake film. Curiously, Johnson, Nixon, Ford all have this simian mug, the monkeys of power. Death is never an absolute criterion, but in this case, it is significant. The era of James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, and the Kennedys, of those who really died simply because they had a mythic dimension that implies death, not for romantic reasons, but because of the fundamental principle of reversal and exchange. This era is a long one. It is now the era of murder by simulation, of the generalized aesthetic of simulation, of the murder alibi, the allegorical resurrection of death, which is only there to sanction the institution of power, without which it no longer has any substance or an autonomous reality. These staged presidential assassinations are revealing because they signal the status of all negativity in the West, political opposition, the left, critical discourse, etc. A simulacral contrast through which power attempts to break the vicious circle of its non existence, of its fundamental irresponsibility, of its suspension. Power floats like money, like language, like theory. Criticism and negativity alone still secrete a phantom of the reality of power. If they become weak for one reason or another, power has no other recourse but to artificially revive and hallucinate them. It is in this way that the Spanish executions still serve as a stimulant to Western liberal democracy, to a dying system of democratic values. Fresh blood, but for how much longer? The deterioration of all power is irresistibly pursued. It is not so much the revolutionary forces that accelerate this process. Often it is quite the opposite. It is the system itself that deploys against its own structures this violence that annuls all substance and all finality. One must not resist this process by trying to confront the system and destroy it, because this system that is dying from being dispossessed of its death expects nothing but that from us, that we give the system back its death, that we revive it through the negative. End of revolutionary praxis. End of the dialectic. Curiously, Nixon, who was not even found worthy of dying at the hands of the most insignificant, chance, unbalanced person. And though it is perhaps true that presidents are assassinated by unbalanced types, this changes nothing. The leftist pendant for detecting a rightist conspiracy beneath this brings out a false problem. The function of bringing death to, or the prophecy, etc., against power has always been fulfilled, from primitive societies to the present, by demented people, crazy people, or neurotics, who nonetheless carry out a social function as fundamental as that of presidents, was nevertheless ritually put to death by Watergate. Watergate is still a mechanism for the ritual murder of power. American institution of the presidency is much more thrilling in this regard than the European. It surrounds itself with all the violence and vicissitudes of primitive power, of savage rituals. But already impeachment is no longer assassination. It happens via the Constitution. Nixon has nevertheless arrived at the goal of which all power dreams, to be taken seriously, though, to constitute a mortal enough danger to the group to be one day relieved of his duties, denounced, and liquidated. Ford doesn't even have this opportunity anymore, a simulacrum of an already dead power. He can only accumulate against himself the signs of reversion through murder. In fact, he is immunized by his impotence, which infuriates him. In contrast to the primitive right, which foresees the official and sacrificial death of the king or the chief is nothing but the promise of his sacrifice. The modern political imaginary goes increasingly in the direction of delaying, of concealing for as long as possible, the death of the head of state. This obsession has accumulated since the era of revolutions and of charismatic leaders, Hitler, Franco, Mao, having no legitimate heirs, no filiation of power, see themselves forced to perpetuate themselves indefinitely. Popular myth never wishes to believe them dead. The pharaohs already did this. It was always one and the same person who incarnated the successive pharaohs. Everything happens as if Mao or Franco had already died several times and had been replaced by his double. From a political point of view, that a head of state remains the same or is someone else doesn't strictly change anything, so long as they resemble each other. For a long time now, a head of state, no matter which one, is nothing but a simulacrum of himself, and only that gives him the power and the quality to govern. No one would grant the least consent, the least devotion to a real person. It is to his double, he being already dead, to which allegiance is given. This myth does nothing but translate the persistence and at the same time the deception of the necessity of the king's sacrificial death. We are still in the same boat. No society knows how to mourn the real power, the social itself, which is implicated in the same loss. And it is through an artificial revitalization of all this that we try to escape this fact. This situation will no doubt end up giving rise to socialism through an unforeseen turn of events and via an irony that is no longer that of history. It is from the death of the social that socialism will emerge, as it is from the death of God that religions emerge. A twisted advent, a perverse event, an intelligible reversion to the logic of reason, as is the fact that power is in the essence no longer present except to conceal that there is no more power, a simulation that can last indefinitely because, as distinct from true power, which is, or was, a structure, a strategy, a relation of force, a stake, it is nothing but the object of a social demand, and thus, as the object of the law of supply and demand, it is no longer subject to violence and death, completely purged of a political dimension. It, like any other commodity, is dependent on mass production and consumption. Its spark has disappeared. Only the fiction of a political universe remains. The same holds true for work. The spark of production, the violence of its stakes no longer exist. The whole world still produces, and increasingly, but subtly, work has become something else, a need, as Marx ideally envisioned it, but not in the same sense, the object of a social demand, like leisure, to which it is equivalent in the course of everyday life. A demand exactly proportional to the loss of a stake in the work process. Same change in fortune as for power. The scenario of work is there to conceal that the real of work, the real of production, had disappeared, and the real of the strike as well, which is no longer a work stoppage, but its alternate pole in the ritual scansion of the social calendar. Everything occurs as if each person had, after declaring a strike, occupied his place and workstation and recommended production, as is the norm in a self-managed occupation, exactly in the same terms as before, all while declaring himself and in virtually being permanently on strike. This is not a dream out of a science fiction. Everywhere, it is a question of doubling the process of work and of a doubling of the process of going on strike. Striking incorporated just as obsolescence is in objects, just as crisis is in production. So there is no longer striking nor work, but both simultaneously. That is to say something else, a magic of work, a trombolio, a scenodrama, so as not to say a melodrama of production, a collection dramaturgy of the empty stage of the social. It is no longer a question of the ideology of work, the traditional ethic that would obscure the real process of work and the objective process of exploitation, but of the scenario of work. In the same way, it is no longer a question of the ideology of power, but of the scenario of power. Ideology only corresponds to a corruption of reality through signs. Simulation corresponds to a short circuit of reality and to its duplication through signs. It is always the goal of the ideological analysis to restore the objective process. It is always a false problem to wish to restore the truth beneath the simulacrum. This is why, in the end, power is so much in tune with ideological discourses and discourses on ideology. That is, they are discourses of truth, always good for countering the mortal blows of simulation, even and especially if they are revolutionary. The end of the panopticon. It is still to this ideology of lived experience, exhumation of the real in its fundamental banality, in its radical authenticity, that the American TV variety experiment attempted on the Loud family in 1971 refers. 7 months of uninterrupted shooting, 300 hours of nonstop broadcasting, without a script or a screenplay, the odyssey of a family, its dramas, its joys, its unexpected events, nonstop. In short, a raw historical document and the greatest television performance, comparable on the scale of our day to day life to the footage of our landing on the moon, becomes more complicated because this family fell apart during the filming. A crisis erupted, the Louds separated, etc. Whence that insoluble controversy, was TV itself responsible? What would have happened if TV hadn't been there? More interesting is the illusion of filming the Louds as if TV weren't there. The producer's triumph was to say, they lived as if we were not there. An absurd, paradoxical formula, neither true nor false, utopian. The as if we were not there being equal to as if you were there. It is this utopia, this paradox that fascinated the 20 million viewers, much more than did the perverse pleasure of violating someone's privacy. In the Variety experience, it is not a question of secrecy or perversion, but of a sort of frisson of the real, or of an aesthetic of the hyperreal, a frisson of ver- vertiginous and phony exactitude, a frisson of simultaneous distancing and magnification, a distortion of scale, of an excessive transparency. All right, let's see how much further we got to go to finish this chapter. Okay, This is a long chapter.
I think we might
stop. Now we got to figure out what page it was on.
Dr. Puppy Be Daddy.
All right, so I think we're going to stop here.
Daddy, Dr. Daddy, Puppy, Doctor.
We got to figure out where we were. I think this is it right here.
Daddy.
Yep, this is it right here. So we're going to stop right here. And we're going to pick this back up tomorrow, chapter 1.2. And so this is some powerful stuff. Thank you to everybody who's following along with us. This is some heavy reading right here. But this is the MasterMind Library podcast. Yeah, it's the MasterMind Library podcast.
That's my baby.
Yeah, so it's the MasterMind Library podcast, and this is where we are creating masterminds, and we are helping encourage masterminds to live righteously. All right, so we're going to go ahead and head on out. Y'all be blessed and expose your gift.
Yeah.